here is another interesting JavaScript question. Now these type of JavaScript questions are going to help you polish your JavaScript knowledge by quite a lot. So you should try attempting to solve these type of problems. Now, first of all, before I run this code, I want you to pause the video and I want you to try this all by yourself. And if you got the answer right, then that's great. You can skip the video all by itself. And if you didn't get it right and you want to know the reason to how this works, then I'm going to explain you line by line how this exactly works. All right, so now once I run this, you can see the output is 5, 5, 5, 5, 5. So basically 5 times 5 and then 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So if you got this output, then congrats, that's amazing. And if you did not, I'll help you understand what's going on over here. So the main part to note here is you should know what var and let do in JavaScript. It is extremely important to know what they do individually. So now you might be confused that the code is almost exactly the same. So what is the reason for these two to print different outputs? Well, there is one thing that's different, right? The way they are declared. This is using var and this is using let. Now, why does that make such a big difference? The first thing we should know is that var is usually global scoped until it is wrapped inside a function, then it becomes a function scoped. So in this case, var is global scoped. So what that means is when I use var of I equals to 0, then so whenever each and every iteration goes on, the I in this set timeout always points to that same memory space. So what that means is whenever each and every new iteration is started, var I is not creating another new memory space for I. So basically this is pretty much writing var I over here is pretty much the same as declaring it like this and removing this var from here. So it just means that it is pointing to that same memory space and it's updating that one variable, that same variable over and over again. It's not basically creating a new memory space for that variable during each iteration. And that's why you see the 5 popping up each and every time or 5 times. So basically once the iteration ends, like when you go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 and then it ends, there's an I++ that occurs in the end after 4, so it becomes 5. But then when the set timeout executes, since I is always pointing to that particular memory space for I and each of the iterations did not create a new memory space for I, so the same value of I is always constantly updated. So once the loop ends, I becomes 5, right? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, then last I++ happens, it becomes 5, and then it sees that 5 less than 5 is not true. So when finally the timer ends for each of those iterations, the loop is already over. The loop occurs very fast, of course, compared to the set timeout. So when finally all the iterations are over, and since I is always pointing to that same memory space and it becomes 5 in the end, so when the set timeout runs for each iteration, it takes that last value which is 5 in the end, and that's why it console logs 5 times. So if you can't wrap your head around this, I'm pretty sure you understood the var concept, that it points to that same memory space. But what's exactly happening is, like when each iteration happens, the I points to that same memory space. So when each iteration is going on, by the time the set timeout executes the code within it, for each iteration, this loop is already over. Alright, this loop is already over. By the time the set timeout starts to implement whatever is present within it, within this callback, the for loop is already over and the I has become the value of 5. So, and since this is pointing to that same value, it is attached to that same memory space, this also ends up printing 5 in every iteration. So each iteration, when they start to console log, it says that after the last iteration was over, I already had taken the value of 5. So it just keeps printing out the value of 5 for each and every iteration, because in the global memory space, that is what got updated. Whereas for let is block scoped. What that means is whenever we are iterating through each of these elements, for each of these elements, the I takes up a new memory space. I creates a new memory space for the variable I. So whenever you go within this block and the set timeout executes, it's creating a new I all within itself. So when I is 0, it takes the value of I as 0. When I becomes 1, it again creates a new memory space, where the console log within this set timeout points to that new memory space of I, which is 1, and then when I becomes 2, the console log I points to the new memory space of I, which is holding 2. So basically within each and every iteration, it's creating a new memory space for I, because let is block scoped and I is always pointing to the new value, and that's why we end up getting 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 and not 5 on repeat. And just to help you understand this in a much better way, I'll just comment this out. You might get confused in this var I approach. So what I'll do is I'll remove this var. I'll in fact not remove that. I'll keep this var I as it is, and I'll show you something. If I just console.log I and let's say keep this as a string. Alright, so now I'm using I out of this scope, right, out of this bracket. So many people would think I will not print anything because it's not initialized anywhere. But as I said before, because we are using var I over here, it's the same as declaring it over here. So what that means is when I console log I, it is going to end up printing 5 for me, even though we are printing it outside of its scope, because var is global scope. So it considers that it's declared globally. And so even if you try to console log this outside of this for loop, it still prints the value of I. So you'll notice this. Let me just comment this out. In fact, now if I just run this, you'll see 5 come up. There you go. You see I is 5. So we're still able to access this outside. Whereas I'll show you what happens. I'll uncomment this now. And let's say I'll comment this part as a whole. I'll uncomment this out. I'll take this console log of I and I'll paste it over here. And now since we are using let over here, and as I had said, let creates a new memory space for each of its variables, right? So within this curly brackets, a new I with a new memory space is created. So when we use let I over here, it's equivalent to using something like when you declare something within this scope, like let I or something like that. So basically it just means that it's only accessible within this scope. That's what it means. When I console log I over here, you will notice like how var was able to print 5, the value of 5. I will not be able to print the value of 5. In fact, I will not even be declared at all. If I run this, you can see it says I is not defined. It cannot even detect I because this is only valid within this memory space, within this curly brackets. And every time the iteration happens, it's creating a new memory space for I. So each of those iterations hold their value and they attach it to this value of I, because that's what they have in their memory space. And so when the I becomes 5, each of those console log of I do not take the value of 5 because they hold on to their subsequent memory space of I. Alright, I hope I made that clear. This is pretty simple. You just have to understand how var, let and const work. Let and const work almost similarly. Var only works in a different way. It is usually global scope, but within a function it is function scope. And just to give you a little more information, I will do something else over here. What I'll do is, there could be some instances where the interviewer says, well, I want you to use var and still be able to print it as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So basically what they mean is, let me just remove this console log. I'll run this again. The interviewer might say that I want you to keep on using var and yet still get the output as 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So how do you do that? That becomes very tricky in that case. So how would you print the value of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 using var itself? Now that is where closures come into picture. So you should be knowing about closures to be able to understand this video. And if you do not know, let me just give you a small brief information. So to be able to print 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 using var, we have to utilize the concept of closures. And to do that, all we have to do is something like this. I'll use function. Let's say I'll call it print. This will be a function. And within this function, I'll just add this set timeout. And I'll call the print with the value of I. And I'll pass I over here. Alright, so what this is doing is, this function is forming a closure with the above block statement. This function is forming a closure with everything that's there within its parent environment. So within the lexical scope of this function, in its parent, there is the value of I, right? So even though we have declared var as I over here, so in the first iteration when I is equal to 0, I goes to this print of I, and now when I goes to this print of I, we are using that parameter over here and we are printing it out over here, right? So basically when we're passing this I over here as a parameter, it ends up creating a new memory space. So it's not attached by reference to this I at all, because variables don't attach as reference in JavaScript. So when I'm passing I as a parameter over here, it is basically its own new memory space. So when I is 0, 0 gets passed over here, and 0 is a completely independent variable with a new memory space. That 0 is passed over here, and then we are console logging the I, which is nothing but 0. Just to show you this works, I'm going to run this. You can see we get 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So using the concept of closures, where when you have a function within another, let's say block, then the function within the block has access to its parent elements. Basically, it has access to all elements within its lexical environment. And for this function, the lexical environment is whatever that's there outside of it. And outside of this function, we have the variable I, right? The var I. When I gets passed down here, it creates its new memory space. It's not referencing to this, it's creating its new memory space, passing I over here. And so each time the set timeout console logs I, it's console logging an I with a new memory space attached to each of them during each iteration. And that's why we end up getting 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So this was just an add-on tip for you to know during your interview rounds if the interviewer decides to trick you during the interview process. Alright, these things can be pretty tricky, so it's important that you try to understand how JavaScript works behind the scenes. And to do that, it's best to not focus too much on how I can crack the interview, but it's best to always try to understand JavaScript in depth first. And once you do that, all the interview cracking and all that is just going to come hand in hand. So you don't have to worry about all that as much. So that's all for the video. If you enjoyed it, I'm going to solve many more such questions very soon, which are going to be tricky and are asked during interview rounds. And it's also going to help you clear a lot of your JavaScript concepts. So if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and stay tuned for more.